We're going to begin looking at the nervous system divisions in tissues. To start, the nervous system can be broken down into a couple different divisions. The first of those divisions is the central nervous system, otherwise known as the CNS. This contains both your brain and your spinal cord, or if you want to make it easy, those structures that lie in the center of your body. The other division is something called the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. This is basically anything that lies outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So, for example, you would have things like the nerves that run through your arms and legs. We can break that down a little bit further and look at a couple divisions in the peripheral nervous system. One of them is called the somatic division. Soma actually means body. The autonomic division is the other of the divisions of the peripheral nervous system, and as the name implies, this is the part of your nervous system that occurs automatically or without conscious thought. We can further break down the autonomic division into two divisions, the first of which is the sympathetic division, and you may have heard of the sympathetic division defined as your fight or flight mechanism. Therefore, it prepares you to do activities like fight or to run for the most part. The parasympathetic is the other of the autonomic divisions of this peripheral nervous system. This you may have heard of as your rest and digest. So the parasympathetic division is most active in situations when you are at rest or after large meals, and let's say you're doing a significant amount of digesting. If you take a look at this picture, you can see that the structures in blue in the center make up your central nervous system, so your brain and your spinal cord. And then outside of that, you can see green and yellow nerves, and then you can also see some of the sympathetic trunks in purple running up and down the spinal cord. Those are going to be parts of your peripheral nervous system. Now, we need to look at what a neuron is. A neuron is basically a nerve cell. So from a structural standpoint, we need to look at the cell body. That's going to be the majority of the structure. It's going to be a large structure that has the nucleus inside of it. We're also going to look at some structures called dendrites. Dendrites are going to be many around the cell body. Their function is to receive messages. So you'll see that a neuron can only receive and or send information in one direction. So they're unidirectional flow of information. So they're going to receive the messages, and like I had mentioned, there's usually more than one dendrite around the cell body. The next structure is something called an axon. The axon is going to be sending messages away from the cell body. Usually, there's only one axon per cell. There's also a structure called the axon hillock. This is the connection between the cell body and the axon. And if you were to look at this structure on a picture, what you'll find is it's kind of a cone-shaped structure where the cell body is narrowing down to the axon. The axon bulb then is the expanded end of an axon. So at the very end of the axon where information would be sent, say, to another neuron or maybe to a muscle cell, for example, the axon will be expanded, and we'll look a little bit more at why that is expanded later. Additionally, inside of the nervous system, we not only have neurons, but we have some supportive type of cells as well. These cells are called neuroglial cells, and they can do a variety of different functions. They can support the cells by maintaining ion balances. They can aid in the blood-brain barrier. So there's a bunch of different functions of these neuroglial cells. Taking a look at this neuron, this is what we call a typical or multipolar neuron. You can see on the left that there is a cell body that contains a nucleus. Around that, there are a bunch of short branched processes. Those would be considered to be your dendrites. And then the one long process that's leaving the cell body is going to be the axon. Further, at the end of that axon, you can see that the axon has some bulbs or expanded ends along its branches. And then again, back up towards the cell body, you can see the axon hillock, which is where the cell body connects to the axon. There are a couple different types of neurons specializing in function. The first one is a sensory neuron. As the name implies, it's going to recognize stimuli, and in this case, it's going to be sending that stimulus towards the cell body. So, like I had mentioned, it does recognize stimuli, say out in your skin, and it sends the messages towards the central nervous system, so either towards the spinal cord or the brain. There are also interneurons. Interneurons are more of a multipolar generic neuron like I had shown you in the previous picture. They're located completely within the central nervous system. These are very small neurons, and their function is to connect a sensory and a motor neuron. So we're going to connect the information coming to the central nervous system and the information leaving that central nervous system. Motor neurons are the third type of neuron, and as the name motor implies, these are sending signals. So they're going to send messages to an effector organ, which we've spoken about being mostly a gland or a muscle. If you take a look at this picture, we've got all three types of neurons. Up at the top right, you can see that in the event that you get a sliver, let's say, you would have a sensory neuron recognizing that pain. It would be sent towards the central nervous system, and in this case, the central nervous system is indicated by the box at the bottom. The sensory neuron synapses with a very small interneuron, which would be completely within the central nervous system, and then it's going to synapse with what we call a motor neuron, and it will send the information then back out to an effector, and in this case, at least, the effector is a muscle. We also need to talk about a structure called the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath covers the axon. It is made up of a lipoprotein. That should indicate to you that there's not only protein in the molecule, but lipid as well. The myelin sheath is not a continuous membrane. There are gaps in the sheath, and they're called the nodes of Ranvier. What the myelin sheath does is it speeds up a nervous impulse by insulating the neuron. So you should recognize that lipid functions as an insulator, and as a result, what happens is that the current or the voltage that is being sent down an axon will only do so at the nodes of Ranvier where there is no myelin. So literally, it speeds up the nerve impulse by insulating that neuron. The term used to describe this is called saltatory conduction. Saltare means to jump, and so literally this means jumping conduction. This also helps peripheral neurons regenerate. So you probably are aware that a peripheral neuron, if damaged, can grow back. Central nervous system doesn't function the same way. However, with the myelin sheath, you can regenerate some of those peripheral neurons. In the event that you have some scar tissue built up where the myelin sheath used to be, you may be experiencing a condition called multiple sclerosis. In this situation, it's an autoimmune disease, so the body attacks its own myelin sheaths, breaks them down, and like I had mentioned, leaves some scar tissue where those myelin sheaths used to be. Therefore, the conduction along those neurons significantly slows and ultimately can stop. The myelin sheath is created by a cell called a Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system and an oligodendrocyte in the central nervous system. So depending on where we're looking at, we'll have one of those two types of cells creating the myelin sheath. Again, taking a look at this picture, you can see along the axon now that there are a couple of regions that are surrounded by this lipoprotein called myelin. Then there are areas in between where there is no myelin. Those are called the nodes of Ranvier. And as the picture indicates, the signal is going to simply jump from node to node as it travels along the distance of the axon.